Hello, everybody. Welcome to our insight session on elucidating orchestration. Thank you all so much for being here, to our wonderful panelists, and to everyone joining us as a participant. Today, we're going to be exploring all things orchestration, and I would honestly love to just jump right in. So, if you have questions in the audience, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can ask them at the end. We'll leave like 10-15 minutes at the end for questions. And so let's start with a little intro. How about we go through and all our panelists can kind of give a little background on yourself and how you got into orchestration. I'll just go in order as y'all appear on my screen. So Zoe, you are up first.
So I'm Zoë. I'm a composer and a songwriter and an artist. I got into orchestration kind of through the AWFC in that I met Catherine. This is forever ago. I think it's like almost a decade ago. And she asked me if I wanted to do some like copyist work and like printing scores and taping scores and all of that. And from there, I got into doing the orchestrating.
Great, thank you, Zoe. Next, let's hear from Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I guess my start in orchestration it came out of necessity at first because when I first graduated, I didn't have like a steady assistantship. So I started just picking up contract gigs. And one of the first ones was working with the composer Tom Howe and, helping him with score prep for like a Universal project he was on. I was like on a small team he had gotten together. So yeah, that's how I started with orchestration. And then after that, I worked with Penka Kunava. So, and she's an amazing orchestrator. So yeah, I kind of learned from there.
Amazing. Let's see, Hope, let's hear from you next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hope. I am also a composer, songwriter, orchestrator. Similar to Zoe, I started orchestrating through Catherine at Joy Music House, and it was a very beginner process of first printing scores and copying, and then eventually leading to leading teams for orchestration. And like Zoe, we've worked on a ton of films like Minari, The Woman King, several notable TV shows and series as well. So I also now teach orchestration in the UCLA film scoring program as well. So I kind of came to it unexpectedly. I have an undergrad in vocal performance and then I did the film scoring program myself at UCLA. I never would have seen myself as an orchestrator, but it's been a really great avenue to work on a ton of different composers' projects and see how they do it, which has been amazing. And also another way to work in film scoring. So yeah, that's kind of my shtick.
Cool. Miguel, how about you next?
So, well, first, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I started with orchestration, I guess, because of my background in playing in orchestras as a violist, and yeah, Kubi from our program hooked me up with Matteo Messina. Then in LA, I started working, as with the additional orchestration on Coco, and then from there I went kind of into it, and nowadays I work with a team with other two partners. And yeah, I firstly composer, but I also have this gig as an orchestrator that I love. So yeah.
Great, and we'll definitely get into that, composing and orchestrating, doing both, balancing it out, all that too. Maria, I'd love to hear from you next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and it's great to hear about everybody's story. I guess the real first moment when I got into orchestration was when I was still a student at Berkeley, because one of the professors over there, Shelton Mirowitz, does a score of a silent film I think it's like once a year. And then there's a group of students that do all the orchestration. So that was definitely my very first experience before coming into the real world.
Awesome. Well, it's great to hear about all of y'all and how you got started. I think the most interesting thing about I live in LA, living in LA and getting to meet other composers is there are no two origin stories that are the same, which is very cool. We all kind of forge our own paths, which is, I don't know, inspiring in its own way. So I'm going to ask a question, which y'all can jump in if you want to answer, or if you don't want to answer this one, that's totally cool. So my first question I want to ask is, do you find it is different orchestrating for another composer versus yourself? Like, let's say you've written some themes, you're orchestrating your themes, versus if you come on as an orchestrator and you're orchestrating someone else's themes. So feel free to jump in.
So I would just say that nowadays, I'm sure everyone might agree with this, but we have a lot of technology at our fingertips. So most of the time when we're writing, we're also orchestrating. And that is usually, not always, but usually true with your clients too, to an extent. So when you're working with another composer, your job is not necessarily to like change their work or fill in gaps. It's really about like interpreting their intention and trying to make the clearest and like best representation of what they're trying to go for. So it's not so much about creating so much as it is about interpreting, if that makes sense.
I would also say like it's not it's different only in that like for me at least, when I'm composing, I don't usually have an end that is live recording. And when I'm orchestrating, that's always the end. I'm never orchestrating somebody's MIDI, but I'm always orchestrating my own MIDI. And then when I'm orchestrating for somebody else, it's because I'm putting it on paper. So I look at them like they're two different jobs. But if it was a job for me that I was taking all the way to the stage, then of course, like I would get into the same process I get into when somebody brings me on board to finish off by a live recording.
Right. For me, I think the biggest difference that I have clear what I want from the beginning, whereas like as like as Zoe said, like your job when you're orchestrating for someone else is interpreting, especially the first time when you work with a client, like it's maybe not as easy to figure out like which parts of the media are absolutely true for the end orchestration and which parts are more like open to discussion. And that room that opens and there like you have to explore with a client and see like oh yeah, I'm more open with the strings to be like rearranged in a way like a revoice or something like that, or like I'm more open to rebalance this because I know it has to sound in the same room, whereas some of the composers might know like already like I want this to be recorded in separate days with the separate sections, then like the balance doesn't matter to me. I want this sound specifically. And so an open conversation is key when you start working for somebody. And yeah, in that conversation you had already with yourself. So that you have like clear in mind, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna record with 20 strings or 40 strings, and I know the limitation already, so I'm gonna write these only and not these other things.
I was gonna jump into that as well, that the communication is so important, especially when it's the first time that you're working with another composer, to figure out what is exactly what the other person needs, and how you can provide that. So I think that's super important. As you were saying, when you're doing that, when you're orchestrating for yourself, you don't really have to, you can't just go for it, right? But when you have the orchestration gig for somebody else, you have to have great communication.
That's a really good point. I think communication is maybe the most important thing of all, always, for all things. And I think it's also the hardest thing to learn because everyone's style is different. And that depends on your Mercury sign if you're into astrology. Anyway, Catherine, was there anything you wanted to say on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly covered, but definitely I feel like for me personally, it is more about interpreting because like, you know, when I'm doing it for myself, like I know my intention. So it's different. But like when I'm orchestrating for someone, it's like you get a sketch and it's like what are the things that they want to keep and what are just ideas that they were floating? Like especially like I guess because I work mostly like in video game music, so it's like almost all the sessions are striped. And so it's like one section at a time. So it's like, what are the themes we want to keep like on its own so we can reuse later? And what's all getting recorded together? And like all these things, like, you know, so communication is so important because I don't want to like miss any of that because then we won't have it to use down the line. So yeah, I think interpretation and just communicating with my boss is usually the most important and different from when I do it for myself.
That all makes sense. And when I started thinking of this question, I kind of thought you would all be saying it's the same, but it's interesting to know that it is different. Let's see. Maybe this would be a good one to ask next. Do you have any tips for transitioning from composing into orchestrating for someone else or for yourself? Do you have any tips on like things to work on or study before making that leap?
Um, so I think I'm gonna start with I think like it's very important to have like I mean especially orchestration is not like composing you can come from many backgrounds, but I think for orchestration it's especially important to have some sort of like classical training, music theory of course, and playing, I mean, doesn't have to be. I mean, I know many like wonderful like pianists that are wonderful orchestrations, and you know, this band is an example. But for me, at least, like it was very helpful to have that experience playing in an orchestra and know the idiosyncrasy of an orchestra, knowing the egos and the stuff that happens in there, like the more human side of the orchestra that also plays a role of when they are recording and the violas don't like this kind of stuff, the oboe doesn't like this kind of stuff, even though it's technically possible, like you learn with time that each instrument has the things that they do very well, the things that they have to rehearse a little bit more, so it's more complicated to get done in a recording session with so little time to get to the third take should be very usable, so shouldn't be a rehearsal already. So mm, for me, like also like that experience and knowing how the orchestra, how the players and their likes and dislikes was very helpful. So classical training and some sort of like contact with the orchestra, I would say it's important.
I think,
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
no, you go.
I was gonna add to that because I mean I do have classical training as well, but at least maybe similar to Zoe's experience too. Like I started as a kind of apprentice as like printing scores, like I had said, and then like a copyist and those kind of jobs before I was given the responsibility of orchestration. So even though I also had a music theory background and a lot of music education, that was really a great entry point. I couldn't have just been some composer's orchestrator straight out of school. I don't think I would have had like the just knowledge of like what's this process and how does it work, because film scoring is so specific and it's such a specific timeline. It's such a specific way of like striping and things like recording and how you run a session and how you pull music from a DAW and things like that, that like my opportunity to be at the bottom of the barrel in a orchestration house was incredibly helpful, was an incredibly helpful place to start. And also just even learning of like, do I really even like this? Could I be good at this? You know, like it's a different beast. So yeah, I would say like, even if you were to just kind of like directly answer your question of like, you're a composer and you want to get into orchestration, like start at the bottom somewhere, start as some orchestrator's assistant who's going to do the MIDI cleanup and things like that are like low risk jobs, but that get you inside the process. Really like any role in the film scoring world, like you just, I think apprenticeship and the opportunity to learn under somebody, you learn the language, you learn how it works, by just like not having to be completely responsible for the whole thing. So that would be my biggest like suggestion if it's something that interests you, is like finding something like Joy Music House or Joanne Kane, and then just like finding a really entry level role in those worlds.
This is like kind of similar to what you're saying, I think, but I feel like I learned the most because kind of like what Hope was saying, like orchestrating for film and TV and video games and like for media is going to be a different beast to doing it for like a concert score or something, because we have a lot of restraints and conditions that like you don't necessarily have if you're just like doing it for performance. I'm sure that comes with its own set of other issues. But when we're doing orchestrating for film and TV, our goal is a session, and at the session, they have to run really smoothly. So I feel like going to sessions and just being able to be there, sometimes just doing take notes, or just like you literally brought the scores, you picked them up and brought them so you were able to stay for the session. I learned the most, because at the end of the day, when you're orchestrating for film and TV, your goal is to have a smooth session and to have your sessions run as easily as possible. And really that does start, well, it should start with the composer, but if it didn't start there, it starts with you as an orchestrator.
The Band-Aid orchestrator. There's always a Band-Aid for every aspect of film, and as composers or orchestrators, it can often be us because we're so far at the end, I think. So sometimes we're expected to come in and fix the unfixable, which is difficult. I see a question from Patricia. Thank you, Patricia. Does anyone else have anything else they wanted to say on that question before I move on?
Yeah, I think like in terms of transitioning from composing to orchestrating, like if you wanted to get into orchestration, like, and you for some reason haven't found your way to a score prep house, I think like try to assist composers who are great orchestrators or who work with great orchestrators. Like I worked with Penka, and then after that I worked with Jermaine Franco, and you know, she worked with an amazing like orchestrator like John Ashton Thomas. And so like just seeing like the pipeline between her as a composer and how it ends up with him, and then how it ends up on the score, and then at the recording session you can hear how it turns out. I think that's all really like valuable experience if you want to get into it. And yeah, I definitely like if you can like get in and hear like a lot of live sessions, that's, to me, that was super important, because like what sounds good in the DAW or looks good doesn't always sound, you know, as expected there. So I think like as many live sessions as you can worm your way into, then try to learn from that.
For sure. So let's see here. From Patricia, what are some of the most helpful things you would like your composer client to provide when you get started on an orchestration project for them? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I have so many thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Just like number one, you guys, you would think that this is common knowledge, but label your motherfucking MIDI tracks, you guys. Okay? Label that shit so fucking clearly. Sorry to swear a lot in a row, but you would be surprised how many times we just get like blank staves. I'm not a mind reader, you guys. I need you to tell me what
And
it is.
to add, I would add like that all the stems start at the same time. So you don't have to figure out like different stems with different lengths where they go like together in the DAW. What else? Like or label like if you're using like a transposing tool for a plugin for a specific track, so I don't have to figure out like the violas were 2 octaves above. I don't know, like there are quite a few. Those the two top of my mind.
Yeah, so typically, like for JMH, this is a pretty well-oiled machine as far as like what we receive by the time we're orchestrating. But starting with, of course, like you need their sessions, and then you need their sessions to be organized. Typically, it'd be great if they were quantized. But then also, like, let's say the composer is writing in a way where sometimes the strings are finicky, they're coming in a little late, so you nudge them a little one way or the other. So bouncing what your intention is as audio, so that if I don't have the same plugins as that composer, I need to be able to hear both the audio and then be able to see the MIDI. So we usually receive stems of each group. We have like, maybe it's as explicit as like a violin one stem, or maybe it's just a string stem, maybe it's a little bit more detailed, maybe it's a short string stem and a long string stem, and then we typically have MIDI. And once you have the audio that's bounced from the composer with their plugins the way that they want it to be, then typically you want MIDI that's also quantized, because once you're pulling MIDI out of a DAW and it's not quantized, it's going to take you 8 years to then adjust everything when you could do it in a click in your DAW. So those are some of the things that come to mind. And then just notes, like anytime, the more details that a composer is giving about what they're intending, the better, especially if they're not super classically trained or like have a ton of experience with live instruments. Like a lot of clients for Joy Music House don't have any experience. There are a lot of band people. And so they write a lot of cool shit in their DAWs, and then we have to interpret it. And so it's always helpful to know like intention, like we talked about earlier, but to be able to describe that to us is like, it's helpful, because sometimes their MIDI is just a trigger and it's not actually the notes. So sometimes we're also interpreting audio by itself without actually having the notes written down. And so it's like, if it's just a string swell going like, like that kind of stuff is just like the more that we have understanding of the composer's desires, we can usually like do a really good job at interpreting that musically when we have clear understanding of where they're going with it.
And just like a quick thing before somebody else hops in on that, like also being upfront with like your expectations of like, I would prefer you guys bring me your ideas to the table. If you have like a better idea for a voicing or something, like, yes, I am open to that, versus no, I really just want exactly what I've written to be on the page. Just knowing that up front can save us like a lot of time.
Right, and to that, like I would add, like to Hope, what was saying, Hope, like about the commenting what you want in a specific place, or markers are very useful to have in the. I mean, I think it's commonplace, but to have markers in, bar 22, like have the strings double by the brass, because I didn't write it on the MIDI, but I wanted like in the final, just the horns or markers. I think are very important for our job to be done more straightforward.
And I will just add to everything that is absolutely perfect what you guys are saying, that is, if as a composer you're not sure, oh, how should I label this or how should I do that, you can always ask questions to your orchestrator. How can I make this easier or clearer for you?
Awesome. Ongoing theme. Communication is coming up a lot, which is good. I think that's something I don't actively think about so much, though I'm constantly communicating with people. That was a great question, Patricia. Thank you. Any last thoughts on that before I ask the next question?
I think it's all covered, but like, Yeah, most important is to have the session, to have the tempo map, and like a list of instrumentation, because sometimes I get the session and I don't even know what's going to record, and I have to like chase the composer down for it. So hopefully they included that. But yeah, so just the basics, and hopefully clean-ish MIDI. Like it's not usually, you know, super clean. Sometimes I'll still have to clean some stuff, but like just label the instruments properly and, you know, be clear about things. Be clear about everything you send to the orchestrator, I think.
Awesome. So organization, communication, clear intent are some things I'm picking up. This is really interesting. Okay, so we have a question from Becca. Becca is working with a new client for the first time, copying and orchestrating a recorded album for live concert for full orchestra. The composer isn't sure how large the ensemble should be, but the MIDI parts, especially the strings, sound pretty full and lush. How can I best advise him about this? Any thoughts on that? It's in the chat too, if you're a reader and not a hearer, for questions.
Becca, are you saying, also, hi, Becca. Are you saying that, okay, so they have their album, but they want to do a live concert, but
Correct.
they're not sure what the ensemble is going to be? Do they have any say in that, or they just don't know at all?
They're not sure yet. There's no like date set or orchestra set. I think he just wants to be ready and then have, you know, basically have all the parts ready. He wants me to do score and concert score and parts so he can just approach orchestras about doing this. So this is the first time he's doing this, and this is the first time I'm doing anything like this too. So I just want to be able to help him figure out, like, you know, like how would he scale this for live orchestra, for concert, and like how would I reflect that in the parts. I mean, he doesn't seem to be very sure about that. So
Yeah,
I will jump in about something. I think it's so important to think about the actual orchestra that you guys will be working with, and if that's not clear, because the orchestras, it depends on the budget that they have, basically, just like if you're in a recording session, right? How many musicians you can have really depends on the budget you have, right? And so I would say, if the composer doesn't know exactly yet what, you know, which orchestra is going to be, I would try to use a standard size orchestra, not too big, not too small. But I actually went through this not too long ago. They gave me the wrong instrumentation, and I, after the fact, and so basically I had to rearrange a bunch of things.
just at the juicy bit.
It might, let's see if she loads.
Might it be the connection with the cell phone?
Oh yeah, it might be. Well, we
I
can.
will, while she's waiting, I'll chime in for 2 seconds and then hopefully she can finish her thought. But hi, Becca. I was just going to say, like, from your standpoint, if you're sort of like, the budget thing is very important, obviously, like how much money you have determines everything. But if they're like, oh, the money isn't necessarily the question at hand, it's more just like, how do I balance this with my music? Like, of course, the things to consider are just like, what's the style? I'd say, again, I have no idea what kind of music it is, but an album that I love that did this is like Gregory Alan Issakoff with the Colorado Symphony, which would, and so it's a standard size symphony, but maybe a good reference point for you of just like listening to how people have done this with their albums, where they've crossed over their current works into like symphony works. Just as a reference point of like, what does it, because it is a little bit like live performance in general is just a different thing than if you're going to go record in a studio. And so like, is that the bigness of like this album, what you think he would want to accomplish, and even being, or he, I said he, and I don't even know. But you
It is
could
a he.
also, you know, like showing them maybe different, or if they have a reference point of styles that they have seen doing the same thing. I think that's a good starting point of just informing you of like how big, because if the MIDI sounds huge, but then it would be like way too overwhelming for the type of music it is, or whatever, and you know, you could maybe pare it back. But yeah, so I think just like trying to figure out a starting point of reference would be a good place for that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, like maybe I would add, meanwhile, like since Maria like is connecting to audio, maybe she's joining now. I'm not sure. Well, I was gonna just say like live strings are different animal than a little bit different animal than the when you go recording in a session, since I mean, this is an album, it's not film scores, but in film scores, we usually have like the samples below, so they are supporting the real strings. So we have like, in actuality, 2 sections of strings under at the same time. Whereas in live strings, like might sound not as expected when they are too little of them, like, so depending on the style, depending on the parts that were written, I saw many samples that they have the full string section for lashness, since that is a concern here, and then like maybe 4 woodwinds, and maybe like you want epic sound for the horns, so you have like 8 horns. So you have to pick where you want the strength and where you want the lashness and epicness, and then not be conditioned because oh, the woodwinds have to be 8, or they have to be 3 trumpets, they have to be like 3 trombones and a tuba. Well, it doesn't have to be always like that. So you put your your exit where you want the sound to be more lush or more epic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. It sounds like on the recording that I have, it sounds like the strings and the horns are extremely full, and then the woodwinds and some of the other parts aren't quite as full. So yeah, that's really good to keep in mind about the like no layering would be happening with MIDI. So yeah, that's really helpful.
Well,
Sorry, we lost you, Maria. But you were saying something really interesting when you got cut out. Would you mind repeating that?
Sorry about that. Yes, my connection failed for a moment. Yeah, well, I mean, I missed what other people have been saying, so I don't know if this was covered, but I think it's so important to know what the budget is going to be, to know how many musicians you're gonna have, so your orchestration is gonna be on point, right? And so having that knowledge is so important, and if you don't have it, I guess you can, depending on what the idea is for the composer, maybe you can talk to the composer and see what their goals are regarding the kind of orchestra that they're gonna have for the session.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
I'm just gonna add one more thing. Like, I don't know what kind of music it is specifically, but like even in live concerts that I've orchestrated for, sometimes they do run pre-records. So if you can find out if they're running pre-records or not, that also helps kind of like figure out what kind of instrumentation he needs to hire and how much he actually needs to spend on, because if you don't need to, like, if you have a chance for pre-records and you don't need everything, like a huge orchestra, then that also helps.
Yeah,
that-
that's really yeah, I know he won't be using pre-records for this, but he wants to have like a synth player having like covering some of the synthy parts. So maybe he could do like synth strings or something for that.
Cool. Thanks for a real world question, Becca. That's cool. Miguel, did you have
Thank
something you wanted to say?
Oh no, I was just gonna mention the Deadline concert that the 2 times that I attended. Like you guys might have gone, and they had the pre-records and it worked very well. So that was an example of a good example. I thought.
Ooh, cool. This kind of segues into another question I had that I was hoping to get to, which we can because we still have time. Orchestration implies full orchestra, but what are your takes on different ensembles, for example, chamber ensemble quartets, folk or rock ensembles? And this is a side note to this question. Sorry, this is a really long question. What do you think do you think it's important to know all instruments and their capabilities? Like, for example, I'm an accordion player, and almost every time I get an accordion part, it's unplayable because they don't play accordion. It makes sense. What do you think is important to know about instruments that maybe aren't orchestral instruments? So that's really 2 questions. Let's start with thoughts on ensembles that are not full orchestra and how to orchestrate. And then if it comes up in that answer, what about weird instruments or, non-orchestral?
Can I start?
think-
Oh, you go.
Okay. Thank you. Well, what I was gonna say is, for me, it's really important if you're using the orchestra or other different instruments, to think about your balance and to think about how you're using your pitch, your lower, middle pitch, high pitch, and how you balance the different instruments that you have, whether it's an orchestra or whether it's guitars. Maybe you have, an accordion, or maybe you have a piano, maybe you have singers. You can take that knowledge and use it and put it towards the instruments that you have. I think once you understand that the different pitch levels that you can have, the balance of the instruments that you can have, so you look at it vertically, horizontally, it doesn't matter so much what instruments exactly you're using, as long as you know the strengths of those instruments. And I'll jump real quick before somebody else goes, regarding using special instruments that maybe you're not familiar with. It's always okay to contact somebody who knows how to play those instruments and be humble about it and be like, hey, I have this orchestration, I have this instrument, can I show you the part? I'll pay you, I'll buy you lunch, I'll help you with something else. Maybe you need some help writing a piano part, or so you can always have some kind of exchange when somebody's helping you and you help somebody else later, or you can pay them for the work, but I think it's okay to reach out and be honest and be like, okay, I'm gonna talk to this person, I know they play this instrument, and so they can give me feedback about it.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, because I was so scared I was going to be the only person who was like, actually, I don't think you need to know every instrument. I really think it's impractical to try and know how to play every instrument, the ins and outs of it. I'm sure there's some people out there with like extreme brain capacity who can do that. But for me, the better skill is, just like Maria said, is to be able to know who to ask. Like, hey, I don't play accordion, but I know Connor does, so I'm gonna ask her to just check this, or just even like give me a quick like, hey, is there like anything you would suggest for me? I have like an accordion part that I just want to make sure is like legible. And I'm sure most people would be like, somebody is thinking about my instrument and I'm so excited about that. Like, especially for like niche specialty instruments, which I think are like probably more and more common these days because we have more and more MIDI available to us. So yeah, and I would say too, like, at least in my experience, which might not be everybody's experience, because we're not in the 1950s golden era film budget film music budget era anymore. We're in the dwindling budgets era. So because of that, it's a lot more common to get smaller ensembles, to get like, okay, we'll see if we can do with the rock band. We'll see if we can, what can we do with the string quartet? So I think in some ways your time is best spent figuring out those smaller orchestras, going to those sessions. There's a lot of advantages to that from a film scoring perspective that people take advantage of because you have more control of the balance in your mix and all of that stuff. So, and you have the control to like, okay, I just want these strings for this cue from that other cue. So yeah, definitely it's worth it to learn about smaller ensembles, and don't stress about knowing every single instrument ever because you're just a person.
Yeah, I was gonna add to that, like with a lot of times the trick in film scoring, like Zoe was saying, is that people like it's tempering what the composer's expectations are going to be if they wrote for a very lush orchestra and we're recording 4 strings. So part of it is like you as a writer, you as a composer, writing for what you have budget for and creating an effective score if you're going to get to record live. And like MIDI is so great, you can layer stuff in. Like Miguel said, like oftentimes we're keeping MIDI strings in even when we're layering things on top. And so part of it is like our challenge as orchestrators is like, this is the ensemble. I mean, especially at Joy Music House, I can't speak for everyone's experience, but like we're working with kind of goofy groups sometimes as far as like what we're given. And the challenge is always like, how can we be effective with this when it's this group and this is what the composer wrote? And so, yeah. And oftentimes like people will come in and they have an instrument that they want to use that's like a little unconventional. And in that case, it's like you find who the player is going to be because there's not that many out there who are going to play at that kind of session level. And you just start communicating earlier on. Even when we've done, like not every orchestrator is necessarily, I mean, I'll speak for myself, like basic orchestra got it down at this point, right? But then even when like we don't always do percussion, and so then even when we have percussion, it's like I'm going to my like percussion key and trying to make sure that I'm representing all the different type of hits and things like that and symbols for them and stuff. And usually like even our percussionists will give us like, this is how I like to see these different things. And so, yeah, I think like having the humility to approach each instrument, especially that you don't play. And also, I teach orchestration at UCLA. Like the first thing I tell my students, even because a lot of them are maybe not even having played with live strings or anything like that yet, is always like, after your piece is done, talk to them about, because a lot of times they'll just play it and they'll play it great. And then afterward, they'll be like, yeah, that wasn't a good like jump from that note to that note, but most players in LA will like not say anything. They'll just play the music and they'll play it beautifully and then it's over. And then if you ask, they might say, actually, like, well, now that you're asking, like, yeah, that's a really uncomfortable, so anytime that you're getting to communicate, you actually will like learn a lot more. And most really high level players that we especially experience in LA, like aren't going to necessarily speak up when things aren't comfy. But then you might learn more if you get to talk to them, which is obviously better at a lower level when there's not hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent for the session. But yeah, I mean, I know you had a question, Connor, about like books or like maybe or like some texts or tools, but I have this little guy. This is just handy dandy.
Yes, I
And,
feel it.
And then this guy, this is Behind Bars, a terrible name, but from Elaine Gould. And I use both of these often. Like Elaine Gould is very much like notation, not necessarily instrument to instrument. Well, it is instrument groups, but it's very, very detailed. This is very general. But if I'm like, oh, I forget if the saxophone can go that low or not, I like will pull this out and just check the ranges. So like having little tools nearby, like some people probably don't need it because they're just that incredible. And some of us need the resource. So yeah, but I think like just humility when you're approaching instruments you don't know. And I also like work with a harpist at UCLA for the class, and she's always like, oh, nobody knows how to write for the harp. Like even people who know, they don't know. Like, and she was telling me all this stuff that I was like she was telling me she prefers no pedal charts and things. And I was like, just like, what? I've been using pedal charts my entire orchestration career. And then this woman tells me, and then she plays all these pieces with the pedal charts. And then at the end, she's like, I actually hate them and don't think and I really don't use them. And I was like, okay, like, so the communication with the player and like, they know that you don't know. It's very obvious to them immediately if they're inside of an instrument. So, yeah.
Which is
anyway,
okay. It's
totally
Not
okay.
the-
Usually most people find a lot of joy out of getting to play. We wouldn't be here doing it. So I think just like that mutual respect for each other is like so important.
Totally.
Anyway, sorry, that was a long spiel.
Right. To what's I would add to what Maria and Zoe said about like you don't have to know every instrument, and to like Hope said like about humility. Sometimes we work with Hexany. It's a group of composers for video games, and they use a ton of instruments from China. Some of them are more commonplace, like in Hollywood, but some of them are like Erhu is pretty common, but then you have Dizzy, Daddy, Siking, Shen, Zhongruan, Guqing. So then like it gets more obscure as it goes, and yeah, you don't have to pretend, oh yeah, I know that instrument. Yeah, no, you don't, and it's okay. I think the most important part is as an orchestrator is you definitely have to know very well the orchestral, the traditional orchestral instruments. You're expected to know those. You cannot say, oh yeah, I didn't know that about the viola. No, I mean, you have to. That's inside your set of skills to know like the common and not so common orchestral instruments, and some of the like outside instrument like electric guitars, like how a drum kit works, like but then the more obscure you get, it's okay like to ask a buddy to like coach you on like so these notes on the top of the register are not so like practical to use them, or that kind of stuff that only the actual player with experience, years of experience, can't let you know about. So humility and ask questions is always a good starting point, as you all guys said before.
That's really helpful, I think. Yeah, I think it can be intimidating too. Oh, something I wanted to bring up. This is connected. My favorite example of someone making a tiny orchestra sound huge is Elmer Bernstein's To Kill a Mockingbird. It's one of my favorite scores ever, and it does feature the accordion, but it all ties together. He was able to make like 8 instruments sound absolutely huge, and this was before like all the modern technology we have today. And I was curious what y'all thought on, or do you have tips on making a little bootstrap orchestra sound bigger? And if it's adding samples, cool. I'm just curious about that as someone who, I end up on my own scores, I play a lot of live instruments, like all those things back there, but then I want to add like orchestra or something. What are your all's thoughts on making a little group sound bigger?
I don't know if this is like,
Sorry.
No, I'm always just so fast on the unmute button. You first.
Okay. I was just gonna say that on the one hand, doing that mixture, right? If you have a low budget and you can record your own instruments, but you don't have the budget to record a full orchestra, maybe you do a combination of real recordings, real instruments with the MIDI, and if you do a good job with your MIDI mockup, you can make it happen. Another thing, something I did a while ago, we had a budget to record a string quartet, and it was a small project. So what did we do? I wanted a full orchestra. We layered them, layer after layer after layer. And you know, if you have I personally work with a mixing engineer, fantastic, and you know, he made sure everything sounded so good together. So from only 4 musicians, we actually got a full orchestra, really. So I think you gotta, you know, think a little bit outside the box.
Yeah, and like I just want to say too, like maybe when you're thinking like, oh, I want something to be huge, like just knowing that the way you would write for a full string section is totally different to what's going to sound good with like 4 or 5 players. And if you have 4 or 5 players, that's what you need to write for. So like an example would be like a lot of strings playing one note, like the same note might sound sick, but like I don't know, if you have like a string quartet and they're just all playing octaves, that might sound like really crazy. So if I had like a string quartet, I would be trying to write kind of closer voicings and trying to make sure that they're all voicings that are going to be tuned pretty well. And then just like Maria said, I would be recording them over and over and over and over, and then lining that up in post. And then the other thing would be like, not something I knew instinctively, but I just learned from doing a lot of sessions, is like, for example, if you have a string section and you want some of them to be doing short stuff like pits or whatever, and you want some of them to be doing legato, don't record those 2 things at the same time. Record your whole section doing legato and then record your whole section doing pits. And maybe do that a couple times and layer them on top of each other. Because if you're splitting up a small ensemble into further smaller ensembles, you're just going to get a sad little sound, which maybe you're going for. I don't know.
To add to that, of you guys, I said like I would add that like Connor said, like To Kill a Mockingbird is a small ensemble, and that's what it is. They don't do overdubs or anything. Like I would like to know very well the chamber music repertoire. It's you can find examples that sounds huge, like with 5 instruments. I mean, now comes to mind the Truth from Schubert. It's a piano quintet, and yes, it has a piano. It sounds, that's an instrument by per se sounds huge, but it has contrabass. I think like adding contrabass to any ensemble, especially like if you have to choose between a string quartet, traditional string quartet, or you have only 4 players, you switch one violin for one contrabass, suddenly the ensemble becomes huge. Like the sound is like unbelievable, like double the sound. And like you have like the Death and the Maiden from also from Schubert, like starts with a unison, I mean octaves actually, that sounds also huge. Like so to have those references in mind and research those in advance, I think it comes very helpful like down the road, like when you have to, like I have to make this ensemble sound huge. And first of all, which ensemble would I choose? Then I have to have a conversation with the composer. Do you mind if I change the cello for a contrabass? Or do you mind if we don't write for 2 violins? So do you mind if we have a clarinet that, yes, you want that sound, but then we have like this other instrument that is gonna really enhance the sound, because I know this reference or I know this other reference and it works, and let's just copy that, because since it works, like why reinvent the wheel when there are so many great examples in the chamber music literature. So yeah, that would be.
Yeah, I think for me, I do agree that like you do have to like have references from repertoire, and because it has been done before, you can make a big sound with a small ensemble, and to like understand your ensemble and understand the instruments you have to work with, where they sound best, where they can sound healthiest, like that all helps. And then of course we have a lot of technology now, so we can also like add something to that. I think something that I didn't always consider was just having a good mix on it, a good mix engineer, or someone who can make it, sound healthy, even healthier than you already had it recorded. And paying attention to these things. Of course, I mean, I am now also still working at Blizzard, so when we record, overdubs are fine, but I also know that overdubs are very costly and not every project can have them. But if you have them and if you have access to them, use them, because you can use all that material later, like either for layering in post to make it sound bigger, or just to have more options for your own compositions. So if that's an option, take those overdubs.
I will add just a little thing. I'm not sure if we mentioned it before or not. Using each instrument in their powerful part of their range, because maybe you have just 5 instruments or 6 instruments or even less, but if you use them in their most powerful part of their range, then you're gonna get the most out of them.
Yeah, I think it comes back to like basic theory too, of like you're covering a dynamic spectrum. Like what does how do you make it small? You know, go even like the opposite way of like how do you make something small? How do you make something big? Like obviously we have dynamics. If you're covering several octaves, it's going to sound bigger than if everything is right next to each other. You know, like use your own music theory skills to kind of just like the basic underlying of like, how do I make music sound bigger? And also like, it's all in perspective to what's like the more intimate sounds too, to me. Like sometimes it's like, you know, what is piano, what is fortissimo, if we're like, it's all a spectrum in the ensemble that we're using, not necessarily like a specific dB, you know what I mean? So use those music theory skills, you know, and understandings. Like, of course, like if you're using powerful ranges, if you're going over like a big span of octaves, and then you need it, like the biggest way, like do that and then come really together. And then the contrast is what also helps make something sound really huge, you know, like if something just plays and it's really loud, you don't know if it's going to get louder, if it's going to get smaller. But if you use the contrast of loud to soft effectively in how you orchestrate across range and dynamic, then like something will sound really big in how you contrast it to what sounds really small too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, just to clarify what I mean about the most powerful range, which I totally agree what you said. But I was also talking about, for example, if you have a flute, and you have a small ensemble, maybe don't write the flute for the very first octave of it, right? Because the sound is a little weaker. So like every instrument has a specific part where they sound better, right? And that being said, I have another commitment, and unfortunately I have to leave. I would love to stay longer, but I have to go. I'm so sorry.
No, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye. Yeah, we're actually out of time, everybody. It literally flew by. I still have more questions, but since you're all my friends, I might email you. I just want to say thank you to all of you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your time. It's incredibly generous of you. Thank you to everyone who spent their time with us for this hour. And I think you should all check out our panelists' amazing, this is obviously my own opinion, but please check out everyone's work if you're interested, because they're all up to such incredible things and all stylistically so different. So feel free to find them on social media or wherever. And thank you all so much. That's all I can say. I'm high on life. This was awesome.
Thank you, Connor, for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
My utter pleasure. And I'll see everyone around, hopefully.
Yeah.
Bye.